a physical barometer did in fact exist, the readings for 2023 would be off the chart. 5,791. That is the number of anti-Semitic incidents B'nai Brith Canada logged between January 1st and December 31st, 2023. That is an average of 15 incidents a day.
That's what it sounded like earlier this week in Ottawa, as B'nai Brith Canada's team presented the Jewish organization's annual audit of anti-Semitism in Canada. Their figures were the highest since B'nai Brith started producing these reports over 40 years ago. Most of the cases are online hate, like social media posts and text messages, but also harassment at work and on campus and in public schools. 77 acts of violence, such as firebombing a synagogue, 462 acts of vandalism. Not since the Holocaust, B'nai Brith says, has Canada's Jewish community faced such a legitimate threat to its survival. And it was a similar message delivered last week in a report on global anti-Semitism by Tel Aviv University with the ADL. That report says, quote, if current trends continue, the curtain will descend on the ability to lead Jewish lives in the West, unquote. When University of Toronto sociology professor Robert Brym saw those latest numbers, he got annoyed. He says the numbers certainly come at a time when things seem very scary for Jews right now, but his work, just published, paints a surprisingly different and more nuanced picture of what's really going on the ground. He teamed up with Ecos Research and asked thousands of Canadians what they really thought about Jews and Israel after the Hamas attack on October 7th, and in light of the Hamas ministry's report about tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties as a result of Israel's ongoing war in Gaza. Now, what Brym found was that most non-Jewish Canadians actually have strongly positive feelings about Jews. So his results suggest a wave of anti-Semitism has not engulfed the general population in Canada.
We've still got 83% expressing positive attitudes towards Jews. That's pretty good. The number of people who express extremely negative attitudes towards Jews is very small.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Thursday, May 9th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
Is life really miserable for the Jews, or are we just glued to a 24-hour news cycle?
Should we be worried that so many young rabbis are coming out of seminary as anti-Zionists?
And what does Judaism say about polyamory?
If you want answers to these questions, well, we don't have any. But we do love asking them. Each week, tune into Bonjour Chai to hear debates and hot takes by me, Avi Feingold,
And me, Phoebe Maltz-Bovy,
as we sit down with pundits, rabbis, and scholars to talk about the most pressing issues facing Jews in Canada and around the world.
Listen and subscribe to Bonjour Chai at thecjn.ca/bonjour or wherever you get your podcasts.
Robert Brym's been scientifically surveying Canada's Jewish community for years, and the latest research was carried out in February, 4 months into the Israeli campaign in Gaza. His findings have just been published in the Canadian Jewish Studies Scholarly Journal. Brym surveyed 3,000 people, and here's what he found. Almost all of the anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hate comes from a small section of Canadian society, 4 main groups: Muslims, political extremists on both the left and the right, university students, and from French Canadians in Quebec. He also found something he didn't expect. Support for Israel has slipped significantly among Jewish Canadians. Robert Brym joins me now from Toronto to explain why the other studies are flawed and what Canadian Jewish leaders should do next.
Thank you very much, Ellen.
We're speaking as lots of the state of the Jewish world surveys have been coming out. Never seen numbers like that, what they're talking about.
Right.
I want to ask you, first of all, for your take on those big numbers for those surveys. What goes through your mind when you see these 1,000 numbers, up 100%, up 130%?
Well, first of all, I have no doubt that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel actions are on the rise. I mean, we read it in the newspaper every day and see it on the news. If they're as extreme as portrayed in some of these reports, I'm not so sure. There's a big difference between the report that I did and the reports coming out of Tel Aviv and of B'nai Brith Canada and so on. They're measuring incidents. I'm measuring the attitudes of individuals. Now, one individual can engage in 100 incidents, right? So the number of incidents can be far larger, and usually is far larger than the number of individuals who are engaged in those incidents. The second issue is that particularly B'nai Brith Canada has quite a broad net, a wide net when it captures incidents. For example, every tweet that is negative on Jews is counted as an incident. So we get some very odd findings that way. In 2020, B'nai Brith Canada found there were 29% more anti-Semitic incidents in Canada than in the United States, which is a preposterous finding because the United States has a population that's 9 times larger than Canada's, and it has a Jewish population that's 15 times larger. So how do you get 29% more incidents here? Only by casting a very wide net. So I have problems with, as far as the Tel Aviv study is concerned, they are amassing information from various countries, and every country has a different method of counting. So we don't know how to compare them. So I'm not really a fan of the B'nai Brith studies or of the Tel Aviv studies. I think they're methodologically very flawed. And what I find, for example, is that the overwhelming majority of Canadian non-Jews have positive attitudes toward Jews. And don't forget, that sample of adult Canadians, non-Jewish Canadians, includes Muslims, Quebecois, students, and so on. So yes, there are anti-Semites in Canada. Yes, there are more people who have negative attitudes towards Jews. But the overwhelming majority of Canadian non-Jews have positive attitudes towards Jews. So it's a very different picture from what the B'nai Brith gives us.
So is it just that there's more noise from smaller, fewer actors, and we're seeing the media focus on it a lot? Because being a media, I have to know if I'm making it worse or I'm just documenting what's happening.
I think that's a large part of it, Ellen. There's more noise. There are probably more anti-Semites around too. But we are not living in Weimar Germany 1932. And sometimes when I read some of the headline stuff about the number of incidents, I get the feeling that they think we're, on the verge of a collapse of society because everybody hates Jews.
Okay, let's get back to the story you were telling me before about who are the ones that are have got the most negative attitudes towards Jews.
Number one group are Muslims, by far. They have the strongest anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiments. And it's actually a little frightening to read the details on specific issues concerning Israel and Jews. For example, on the Israel scale, people were asked, how strongly do you agree or disagree with the opinion that Israel is an apartheid state or that Zionism is racism? On the Jewish scale, they were asked questions like, how strongly do you agree or disagree with the view that Jews have too much power in Canadian society? Those kinds of things. I found that a worryingly large percentage of Muslims believe, for example, that the suicide bombing of Israeli civilians is justified. When you see percentages like you see in this study, it's very upsetting. Or that, nearly half of Muslims in Canada believe that Jews are the cause of all of the negatives involved in globalization. Nearly half. The figure for the population in general is 5%. The anti-Soros people. But when you see that it's over 40% among Muslims, that's really a serious issue. We have a lot of serious outreach to do. And rather than attacking these people, we need to be talking to them. When the attack occurred on a Quebec mosque 7 years ago, members of Holy Blossom, including me, went to a mosque and we surrounded the mosque in a circle of friendship and we went to their service. And that's a kind of outreach I'm talking about, because when the Tree of Life incident happened in the United States, they came to Holy Blossom, the Muslims did, and did the same thing. We have to create that kind of camaraderie and understanding between the two groups. in order to lower the animosity, which is really widespread, especially among younger Muslims in Canada, because it's there, it's real. Then we have university students. I was shocked by this. I can list 100 studies that show that when you go to university, you become increasingly tolerant of various minority groups, ethnic, racial, religious, gender, and so on, with an exception now. The exception is that when students go to university, they apparently become more anti-Semitic. I'm not saying anti-Israel. They become more anti-Israel too. But anti-Semitic, they have more negative attitudes toward Jews. So that's very troublesome. This is a reversal of a pattern that's existed for a long time. They're not as extreme on the whole as the Muslims tend to be, but there is a significantly higher level of anti-Jewish sentiment among university students than there is among the non-Jewish population as a whole. And about anti-Israel sentiment, a lot more. And I'm sorry to say that there are more than a few university professors who are teaching that hatred of Israel and negativism towards Jews. I just got involved yesterday. I'll send this to you. There's a professor at Brock University who's been spewing all kinds of nonsense. And I was asked by the St. Catherine's newspaper to comment on what he had to say. And I read some of it. It's really appalling. And obviously, this is affecting students who don't know, who are impressed with smooth talk and the fact that there's a PhD degree, that this person has achieved. The third group I singled out, and now we're moving from the most anti-Jewish and anti-Israel to the less negative, are the Quebecois. If you know anything about Jews in Quebec, you know that there's a long history of anti-Jewish feeling. And the Quebecois, to this day, have more negative feelings, significantly more negative feelings towards Jews and Israel, especially towards Israel, than the Canadian population as a whole. So those are the groups that I singled out.
You go to university, you're a prof at U of T.
And you hired in December.
Still, you're in a university environment. Your wife is, I have to say, president of York. You see the campus encampments that are up. These are small groups of people making lots of noise. And yet, here you just said you're very worried and shocked about what's going on in the university milieu. But then earlier you said it's not all Canadians. How can both be true?
First of all, university students are not all Canadians. They're not all non-Jewish Canadians. These encampments are not all university students, for that matter. It's organized not just by students. A lot of the students who are involved in the encampments are themselves Muslims. Yeah, there's a lot of noise. It's from a particular segment of the community, but it's not a mirror of what's going on in the larger society.
But you're saying it does help make Canadian Jews feel unsafe.
Of course it does.
Because they see the noise, even though it's smaller people.
Especially many Jewish students, especially Jewish students with a strong attachment to the state of Israel. We've seen students, in tears over what's happening in the universities.
Can you explain it because of social media, that they don't understand about the Holocaust? They didn't have grandparents who were Holocaust survivors. They didn't live. They don't understand Israel's independence. They missed that whole historical context. All they see is YouTube and TikTok, and that's where they get their stuff.
And they're living through the most right-wing government in Israel's history and carnage among the civilian population of Gaza. And that's what they see. That's what they know. And they don't know the history. They haven't been taught the history. We've done an awful job of educating the public about the history of the Jews in that region, the 3,000 years of continuous Jewish presence, the fact that we've had 3 Jewish states in ancient times in the region, the fact that 850,000 Sfaradim, Mizrahim were kicked out of the Arab and Muslim countries in the 1950s and 1960s, and most of them wound up in Israel that were not the Israelis. Half the Israeli population is non-white. I mean, none of this is known. And, we've done a lousy job of teaching it. So, I mean, we're to blame. The professoriate is to blame.
Not a pretty picture.
Not a pretty picture. That's why I'm saying that the community needs to reach out and explain itself and not just be on the defensive and not just being anti-Muslim. Of course, Hamas is a terrorist organization. I understand. Let's not dwell so much on that and dwell more on reaching out, finding common ground, trying to discuss how this terrible situation can be resolved in Canada and in Israel.
So is there anything else you want our readers and listeners to understand?
Yes. I would like to mention a surprising finding. I looked at the correlation between attitudes towards Jews and attitudes toward Israel. It is not true that they're perfectly or even strongly correlated. The two groups with this, where there's the strongest correlation between attitudes towards Jews and attitudes toward Israel are, first of all, Muslims. And the other group that is where this correlation is strong are elderly, conservative voters. They have strong positive views toward Israel and towards Jews. But here's what I found surprising. If you look at the left, NDP supporters, young people, non-Jews, what that means is that it's possible and apparently quite common for students to have negative attitudes toward Israel but not towards Jews. Anti-Israelism is not the same thing as anti-Semitism.
For them.
For them.
Because our community, the majority thinks it is.
It's a little hard to understand, but it's, as far as I can tell, an accurate finding. Many students have strong negative attitudes toward Israel, but not toward Jews.
But it doesn't come out in a wash? In other words, maybe it's just some hate Israel, some hate Jews, some don't hate Israel.
No, it's important because it falsifies the statement that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is not an accurate statement. It's true for some groups. It's truest for the Muslim population of Canada.
I guess the bottom line is, in your survey, you made a lot of reference many times to the fact that there was like 20%, 30% of people that didn't want to answer or didn't know. Maybe people don't want to say, maybe they're not educated, maybe they haven't thought it through, they don't even know what river to the sea, things like that.
There's a lot of ignorance. We need to do something about that.
So you also surveyed how Canadian Jews are feeling in February. Not that long ago. Your article came out in the end of March, so it's just 6 weeks ago. How are Canadian Jews feeling since October 7th?
Most Canadian Jews, not all, are feeling frightened, threatened, and they believe that anti-Semitism has risen to unheard of proportions. In other words, the tendency of the majority of Canadian Jews is to agree more or less with the findings of the B'nai Brith audit and the Tel Aviv study.
Is it Jew hatred, or is it Israel hatred and Zionism hatred, or both?
Really important question. They're interpreting it as anti-Semitism, period. They interpret extreme rhetoric and action concerning Israel as anti-Semitism. And I think that that's what counts. I mean, when you try to determine the level of prejudice that's being expressed or the level of discrimination being experienced by people, you have to ask the people themselves. You can't rely on anything else other than the opinions of Jews. The fact is that a very large proportion, 2/3 of Canadian Jews, feel that the situation is serious, dire, and it will probably get worse. A third don't feel that way.
Your study also found something extremely concerning for people who support Israel, and that is that although 70% of Canadian Jews are deeply attached to Israel, that is dropping from before October 7th.
Right.
Can you explain why you're concerned about that and how that plays forward in policy for the future?
Well, it's true that in surveys conducted in 2018 and in 2023 before October 7th, about 77% of Canadian Jews expressed emotional attachment to Israel. In the 2024 survey, the figure was 70%, which is a statistically significant drop. And I think that what's happening is that a substantial proportion of Canadian Jews are feeling detached from Israel, more detached than they used to, because of the policies of the most right-wing government in Israel's history, and because of the conduct of the Israel-Hamas war. I think that I know from the study that Israel has lost the public relations battle in terms of the Canadian population, with 50% of Canadians now having negative attitudes toward Israel. But support is also eroding in the Jewish community, and it's eroding particularly among younger Jewish Canadians. And that's an issue, because if you look at younger Jewish Canadians, that's the future. So I'm not happy about those findings at all. I was surprised to see the magnitude of the drop from an average of 77% having, good, warm emotional ties toward Israel to only 70%. I can't predict if that's temporary. I don't know if it's temporary. I don't know if it'll persist. I don't know if it'll change after the war is over. One hopes that it will, but that's what it was in February 2024, which is worrying enough.
Okay, so full disclosure, you are on the board of a progressive Jewish organization, New Israel Fund. And so our listeners should know that you've done surveys for them, too, about political divisions in Israel before October 7th, which we wrote about. I wanted to ask you, did you drill down into the several hundred Jewish Canadians that you interviewed about their support for Israel declining, whether by age or by political affiliation or by whether they're Israeli or Russian immigrants or where they came from?
Well, certainly by age and political affiliation. At first age, yes, there's a decline in support for Israel in the younger age cohorts. It's strongest in the oldest age cohorts. That's a pretty clear finding. There's absolutely no doubt that Jewish supporters of the NDP are less attached to Israel on the whole and more critical of what's going on in Israel than are people in the other two parties. And the conservative supporters are most pro-Israel and most attached to the Israeli state emotionally.
You were also critical of the gap or the disconnect between the Canadian Jewish leadership and what people on the ground who are in your survey are feeling towards the possibility of a two-state solution, peace with the Palestinians, rights for both sides. Can you tell me what you feel, why you felt the need to say that and criticize the leadership like CJ, B'nai Brith, and Wiesenthal, and all the people who are speaking for the Jews?
You already know how I feel about some of the so-called research that's been done. I insert so-called because it really doesn't meet the professional standards. But I would say, in addition to that, I get the sense that all of these organizations are in defensive and hair-on-fire mode. And I think that there is not enough of an attempt being made by these organizations to reach out to people, to try to talk to the Muslim community, for example, which has the highest level of anti-Semitism and the highest level of anti-Israel feelings of any group I could find in Canadian society. All I see is being defensive and quite aggressive in the defense. I don't see there a lot of talk about important parts of Palestinian suffering and history. For example, we have a problem of a lot of settler violence on the West Bank right now, and that gets played down in a lot of the rhetoric of the Jewish establishment, let's call it. Similarly with other issues. I mean, with judicial reform, which is actually progressing now in Israel. And if that gets
right, we know a lot about it. We've talked about this.
Yes, I know, but
I'm going to shortcut it because I want to get back to what your study is.
Yes.
It's not fringe people anymore. What are the numbers that you found of people who feel that way in the Jewish population?
It depends on what question was asked.
But the settlers one, I think it was, right?
Well, no, I asked a question about how many people. What do you think that the Jewish settlements in the West Bank are legal or illegal? And 51% of the Jewish respondents said illegal. That's nothing you're going to hear from the leadership of the community. And yet the opinion is drifting in that direction. We want to see peace, and when we know that peace can exist only if both nations are satisfied with sovereignty.
We'll put the link to your study in our show notes, as well as to your new book, which just came out as well, called The Ever-Dying People, which...
With a question mark.
With a question mark, which we have to talk about too at another podcast.
I look forward to it.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily. Our show producer is Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman. And our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. While his study was done in February, when Canadians felt under threat, if he did another survey now, the numbers might show even more unease. This week, the City of Ottawa and the local Jewish Federation canceled the annual public ceremony set for next week, where usually the mayor and dignitaries raise the Israeli flag outside City Hall for Israel's Independence Day. It was done out of safety concerns. The flag is still going up, though. And an Israeli-Canadian artist in Vancouver, who was supposed to display several of her pieces, was told that her work is no longer welcome in the gallery show because of Israel-Gaza, even though her installations are about Barbie and Ken. You can read that story and more on our website at thecjn.ca. And you can write to me at ebesner@thecjn.ca. And thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest-running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.